A spooky goth boy comes back to life to dish out some vengeance. But is this vengeance actually causing him more anguish? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a graphic novel that I read because I am back on that graphic novel grind, and I wanted to focus on a story, a pretty popular graphic novel that is about murder, crows, and revenge. I'm referring to The Crow by James O. Barr, which was published in 1981. Pretty interesting cover here. There's a panel in the graphic novel, in the comic, that looks exactly like this, which is pretty cool. Most of the art is pretty high quality, and I'll talk about that more in the analysis section. But for those who don't know, James O. Barr is an American author, white American author who was who's lived throughout the 1900s and the 2000s. He's mostly known for writing The Crow series here. I have a special edition, I should point out, which has some new art that wasn't featured in the original. I bet it's probably really difficult to find an original. But yeah, James has also written for a number of other comic book companies in a variety of stories, but I think he's mostly known for this, especially because it was turned into a pretty excellent movie, followed by 3 poor movies, and then a remake, which is of varying quality depending on when this comes out. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm optimistic, but it's hard to really top that first movie with Brandon Lee. James was also part of the military. I believe he was in the Marines, and he wrote this partially while he was in the Marines, and it's based on sort of an experience he had where his fiancé was hit by a drunk driver, which is unfortunate, and he was trying to work out his anger and frustration with that, but as he found out, like, the more he wrote, the angrier he got. And so maybe you definitely see a little bit of that as you go through the Crow, as you go through the story. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section as well. Pretty interesting author. But without further ado, let's talk about The Crow. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Crow focuses on Eric. In the movie, he's called Eric Draven. I don't think he has a last name that's specified in the book, or in the comic book, but he and his girlfriend, his fiance, died 1 year prior to the start of the story. They were murdered by a group of gangsters led by T-Bird, and Eric was shot in the head twice, while his girlfriend was shot and then raped and shot at the same time. A very violent death for her. And then Eric managed to survive a little bit to make it to the ER, but he died either during or after surgery, and he's been kind of wandering around the afterlife, not fully committing to heaven or hell or wherever you go after you die. But he's come back for some vengeance. We see at the beginning of the story. We then see that his adventures in killing members of that original gang, including 1010, Top Dollar, and Tom Tom. And along the way, we see his memories of Shelley, how he loved her. She provided great comfort for him because there seems to be an underlying sadness to him in his life. And he proposed to her. They had a whole life planned, but eventually they were driving on the road when they ran into some car trouble, and that's when the gang showed up and proceeded to kill them. And so this is why he's on this quest for revenge. But we also see, as he's thinking about Shelley, Eric becomes filled with pain and anguish because his the memories aren't very happy for him, and the crow that's following him around is telling him to just not look at it. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. You're only making yourself more miserable. Before he kills Tom Tom, he discovers that they took the ring that he gave Shelley for when he was proposing to her, and so he goes to the pawn shop, kills the pawn shop owner, a man named Gideon, and then takes back the ring. A police officer shows up, but Eric tells him to go away because he doesn't want collateral damage to be a thing here. And the police officer does go away. I think he tells his commander, who somewhat knows Eric, but that's not really followed up upon there. He then runs into Fun Boy, a bit of a heroin addict, and he demands, or a morphine addict, I think, and he demands that Funbird take him to T-Bird. Eventually, Funboy does lead him there, where Funboy overdoses on morphine and dies, and then Eric proceeds to kill the rest of T-Bird's gang. They can't really hurt him. Like, he can only really hurt himself, but he does leave quite a mark on T-Bird's gang. And then T-Bird proceeds to flee, but his car, he gets into an accident at the original crime scene where they originally killed Eric and Shelley. And then Eric proceeds to beat him to death with a claw hammer, which is amazing and very justice. And, you know, and T-Bird definitely deserved that. And then Eric is like, why am I still here? And the Crow tells him that he has to forgive. Eric's like, I don't want to forgive them. They were monsters. And the Crow says, no, you have to forgive yourself. You can't keep blaming yourself for what happened to Shelley. And Eric then proceeds to presumably forgive himself, and he rests at Shelley's grave before presumably Eric moves on to some point in the afterlife, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there's a fair bit to talk about with the Crow here. One of the main themes that James O. Barr seems to be writing about here is that of pain, especially the pain of losing a loved one, the pain of watching, you know, bad things happen to people. Eric seems to be a revenant driven by pain, suffering, and vengeance. I say the word revenant, which is just a creature that is brought back to life for one reason or another. But there could be another proper term that I'm not using here. I'm just using the vocabulary that I have. And so he's driven by that pain and suffering and vengeance, a desire to bring to justice the people who did not receive any punishment for what they did to him and Shelley. But he finds himself tormented by these memories. Every time he thinks of Shelley, it fills him with more misery, more sadness, and grief. And it makes his time, you know, like he's filled with joy at the thought of executing these people, but he's also filled with this deep sense of anguish. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. Eric screams and screams and pounds his head against the wall until phantom fire trucks race across his vision. All he wants is pain and hate, yes, hate, but never fear. Fear is for the enemy, fear and bullets. And I feel like that's a very accurate summary of who Eric is in this story. He's been dealing with quite a bit, the loss of a loved one, and so he given that he's driven by vengeance for that, he's constantly thinking of it, and so he's just enmeshed in this fear and sadness, but not even fear, like grief and sadness, and like he can't allow himself to feel fear because fear is what he's going to unleash upon T-Bird and his friends. And he can't allow himself to feel that. He has to be strong and allow himself to exact this violence against these people. It should be noted that this pain seemed to exist while he was alive. We see in these flashbacks that there's a sense of sadness about him. He's like Tears of a Clown, where he makes a bunch of jokes, but there's something underneath that's tormenting him, and it's only with Shelley can he find contentment in life. Can he find a little bit of happiness and joy? But it could also be the case that maybe these memories are tainted by the fact that he's dead now. Like, maybe it's the case that he was never really sad, but he's thinking back upon it, and he knows what the outcome is. So all of these memories are tinged with sadness, with grief. That certainly happens to people who've been dealing with depression, as is the case with someone who would be dead and who is dead because they were murdered and whatnot. It should also be noted that the crow says that Eric is doing this to himself. He could have just moved on, gone with death, and moved on to whatever afterlife was awaiting him. But instead he chose to linger on and focus on these people, and focus on the death that he experienced and that he witnessed for Shelley. And so in that way, he's simply too mad to die. He's a being driven by pure spite, but that's not healthy. You know, if you're enmeshed in those feelings too long, it's going to fill you with a deep, great sense of anguish, as I said in the introduction of this video. Now, all of this is important because it's sort of reflecting the author's life. He noted that he was writing this as a way to sort of address the feelings about the death of his fiancé, who was hit in a drunk driving accident. And he said that as he continued to write, he got angrier and angrier because he couldn't find any of that comfort, which is unfortunate. To kind of be enmeshed in those feelings and not be able to do anything about it. So there is something interesting to note about the author's life, and I hope that they were eventually able to find that sense of peace or something like that, and maybe even forgiveness, because forgiveness is also a part of this this story, especially as you see at the end with the raven. They're like, you need to forgive Eric, and Eric's like, I would never forgive them. Look at what they did, and the crow is like, no, you have to forgive yourself. It wasn't your fault that they did what they did. You did your best to save Shelley, and it wasn't enough, and you don't need to go on blaming yourself for that. You just need to go on into the afterlife. Maybe you'll be reunited with Shelley. Who is to say? But there is that need for forgiveness, which is maybe what James Barr was trying to figure out for himself there. Another interesting aspect of The Crow is the crime-ridden setting. Eric's city is filled with gang violence and murder. I think it's a version of Detroit, which has historically seen quite a bit of violence. And the story has a very noir feeling to it, specifically focusing on like fatalism and cynicism of how the world works, because it starts with Eric and Shelley dying, and like this is a poor outcome, but maybe that's all you can really expect from life. And there's these feelings of betrayal and just a very gritty look at the streets, which is what you often see in noir. So I do have to give Barr credit for managing to sort of maintain that atmosphere throughout the story. And it should also be noted that Eric's actions really seem like a drop in the bucket. There's a lot of murder going on, and no one's really noticing Eric's additional murder. And so he's he's killing, but like again, it's like you look at the city around Eric, and it's a violent state. No one's going to notice like these additional murders. No, the police aren't even singling him out really, because the police probably have too much on their plate. But it should also be noted that Eric does do good. Like he's not simply doing violence. He sees a random little girl and he convinces her mother to maybe stop doing heroin or morphine, and that's good. You see that in the movie, and it's presented as a bit more miraculous. Here, it just sort of happens, and you don't even know if what's going to happen to like that woman after the story ends. But it's good to see Eric doing more than just murder here. It really gives credence to the fact that he was a very noble and good person in his life, which we also see when he interacts with Shelley through the flashbacks in the story. I will point out that the messaging does seem to be very it exemplifies Reagan, the messaging of the Reagan 80s, where the city streets are filled with violence, and we need like the police to come in and protect us, and drugs are running rampant in the inner city, ignoring the fact that it was the United States that introduced these drugs in the first place, ignoring the fact that the police were often doing violence to people of color, and that the system was in place that kind of made it so you had to, at least if you were a person of color, you had to engage in some violence in order to get the resources you need in order to provide for your family, in order to really survive in this system that wasn't going to give you a fair shake. Now, none of this is James O'Barr's fault, but it should be noted that he is falling into that trap of presenting the inner city as a more violent place than it maybe actually was, and it was pretty violent according to statistics back in the 80s. But this kind of like portrays the inner city as a place where only violence exists, and ignores that violence can exist elsewhere too. And again, you have those whole systemic issues, and it's not O'Barr's job to really portray that, but given that this was written in the 1980s and there are other similar stories that have similar kind of themes and messaging, it's important to acknowledge what was being said out there, what messages were being sent about certain types of people and certain types of places. Religion also plays a role in The Crow. Barr uses many references to Christianity as well as a couple of other religions. You see references to Christianity in the use of heaven and hell. I believe Eric says that he has many companions in heaven and a few comrades in hell, as one of the many kind of turn of phrases he says to various people. You get references to God. And you also see a lot of references to Jesus' crucifixion and the crown of thorns. Eric specifically says that T-Bird placed a crown of thorns on his head when he killed him. And then you also see like a visual representation of Jesus with the crown of thorns in one of the panels, which I feel isn't exactly subtle, but it lends credence to the over the top nature of this story. Definitely a very specific image and specific type of sort of theme in mind in that regard, and I rather quite like it. It makes the story seem more grander than maybe it would be without that kind of mindset. It's not simply like Eric doing violence. He's being given like permission from on high to enact this violence against these terrible people. And it should also be noted that the idea of the crow has existed as a symbol in many religions, either as a symbol of the divine or a symbol of death, or like a farrier to the afterlife in some way, which is what happens in this story. It's not out of place to use the crow in this way, and I think, well, although in the Sandman, like, it's actually a raven, Matthew the Raven, but birds are still used as a symbol and have power in those stories as well. And in fact, I do think in a lot of ways this very much resembles what would later become the Sandman. This kind of came first, especially with the depiction of Eric. Because he looks very much like Dream, although again Dream came afterwards. Although this is the Sandman if it was way more depressing and had no possibility of hope. Although there is a little bit of hope, but it's much more depressing and nihilistic, I would say, than the Sandman. Another great thing about this is the art. The art looks very beautiful. It's also very violent, especially as the story goes on and Eric becomes more desperate to enact violence against those who wronged him. It's kind of contrasted against the beauty of Shelley and Eric's relationship with what he would later become, and the horror and the anguish that he would feel. I think art plays a large role here in depicting that, which is what you would need in a graphic novel. So a lot of credit to James O'Barr in that area. And then there are a couple of issues. Of course, there's an example of fridging here, where a woman is killed for the character development of a man. Which I would say it's not as bad because Eric also dies, so they're both kind of fridged, but Eric is the only one who comes back, so it's just important to note that. And then some of the dialogue does seem like nonsense, like Eric is just saying random phrases without rhyme or reason. It's meant to seem like particularly deep or complex when it's actually not. So it doesn't, both of these things don't really sink the story in that regard, but it's important to note them and note that there's some gaps in the excellence of this overall story. Anyway, anyway, those are my thoughts on The Crow by James O. Barr, a high-quality graphic novel that would later be adapted into a pretty high-quality movie. Brandon Lee does a great job in the movie. I highly recommend that you go check out that movie if you haven't done so already. It's very much 90s, especially early 90s, but it does have a lot of power and oomph, I would say, that make it a very necessary movie to watch. And I certainly hope that the remake that's coming out is pretty good, although I have my doubts with modern Hollywood. But yeah, I definitely recommend that you go out and read The Crow. I have a special edition. You could probably find another much probably cheaper edition at your local library, or even just buy one at a comic book shop. It's worth purchasing. The art alone is beautiful, but the story, I feel, is it's very simple. Just a man seeking revenge, but there's a lot of emotion and a lot of power in that regard. So I definitely recommend that you seek this out. Might end up on my year-end list, but it has a lot of competition at this point, so we'll see about that. If you have any thoughts about this, let me know in the comments below if you just want to comment on the story or my review here. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about The Crow or James O. Barr if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and vengeance-seeking travels. Farewell.